Welcome to the second season of Adapt, Climate Change and the Built Environment, where we interview professionals across the private and public sectors to discuss adapting the built environment to a changing climate. We believe that ensuring climate adaptation to extreme weather and evolving climate patterns needs us to re-examine what it takes to make our buildings, infrastructure, and communities resilient and adaptable, so that our society can continue to thrive for years and decades to come. And with that, let's get started. Today we're talking to Alison Sant. Alison is the co-founder of the Studio for Urban Projects, a design collaborative focused on integrating social justice and sustainability into urbanism through public programming, prototyping, and civic dialogue. She's the author of a book called From the Ground Up: Local Efforts to Create Resilient Cities, which we'll talk about during a conversation. I met Alison at a summit in Philadelphia when she talked about this book. She's also a frequent speaker for major organizations like the Smithsonian and the American Planning Association, and her writing has been featured in U.S. News and in World Report, Next City, Streets Blog, Earth Island Magazine, and Fast Company. Jessica, I am so excited to talk to Alison today.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. Alison has so many amazing stories, and obviously we didn't cover every example in her book, but I really love her book. Is a really good one for when you're feeling a little bit hopeless or there's just what can I do. A lot of it really is, in some cases, it's as tiny as one little parking spot. She kicks off the book talking about parklets, which I just think is fascinating and shows that you can have a big impact even in a very small space. And a lot of her discussions too are very much at the community level, which Monica, you and I have talked about a lot, that it's not just about making sure that each building is resilient to climate change. We need to make sure that we have resilient communities and empowered communities. And so we talk about public transportation, obviously, which can address so many issues, but also climate change. We even talk about the whole congestion pricing issue in New York. We talk about bikes in Minnesota, which of course I get very excited about any reference to my home state. So it's just a really fantastic conversation with her.
That's right. We also talk about her upcoming book. For those who haven't read her first book, there is a discount code for our listeners on the Island Press website, a 20% off discount for our listeners. The discount code is GROUND, GROUND. I can't wait to share this great conversation with our audience. Are you ready to get started, Jessica?
I am.
Let's do it. Welcome, Alison. Let's start with you telling us about your background and your work in the climate resilience space.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to both of you for having me today. This is an honor to be on this podcast. So my roots are actually in urban design, and in around 2006, I co-founded a practice called the Studio for Urban Projects. And we were a group of urbanists working at the intersection of architecture and art and social activism. And we were engaged in tactical experiments at a time when many cities were being shaped by them. In 2009, Times Square was actually closed to cars and pedestrianized. So we were working towards enlivening the public spaces around us, and we were making playgrounds in abandoned plazas and community event spaces and on underutilized sidewalks, and chalking up temporary bike lanes on the streets that needed them. And then we folded this together with a lot of tours and public programs where we brought the public together to discuss the future of cities. And really during those years, I became convinced that cities are so crucial to our efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. They're the places where the majority of us live as the world's population has tipped to urban. And the ways in which we live in cities really matters. Cities are responsible for 75% of global carbon emissions. And we need to cut those emissions by half by the end of this decade, just to avoid the worst of its effects. But I'm sure both of you and I certainly have. We've all experienced extreme weather, storms and wildfires and intense heat and flooding. So I believe cities are the place to act. And I do all I can in my work to explore ways to mitigate and adapt to climate change, not only by doing what is necessary to manage the road ahead, but also to improve the way we live in the process.
I am becoming more and more obsessed with urban planning. I remember, and I think I actually have a book. My Goodreads now is like half nature books and half urban planning books. I also feel like at some point I've got it on my shelf that I need to read The Power Broker.
I'm reading it now.
Have you read that?
Yeah, I'm in the process. It's the 50th anniversary this year.
Right.
And so
And he's
living
obviously,
in,
well, tell a little bit just about him, just since we brought him up, because I'm obsessed.
oh, Robert Caro or Robert Moses?
Okay, good point. I think Robert Moses is the actual power broker, right?
Yeah, so Robert Caro is the writer of that
Right.
book. I mean, it's the 50th anniversary of it. It's a 1,300-page book explaining the way in which Robert Moses came to power in New York City. And he was never elected to office. And yet he had an indelible impact on this city. I live in New York City now, once lived in San Francisco. And it's been amazing to read that book in light of living near highways like the BQE and to understand how a lot of the systems that he developed as roadways that flowed through communities, he ended up displacing something like 250,000 people.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I'm right now in the process of actually writing an article looking at all the communities along a 15-mile stretch of highway, that is not usually the way in which communities think about organizing, and how they are organizing to think about the future of that highway. And if there's a possibility to no longer make it have such an impact on their community, to redesign it, to tear it down, to do, to think about options. So it's a very potent book to be reading right now.
Which is why, and yes, it is so long. I have to admit, I'm a big bookworm, but even for me, that's daunting. But I do need to get into it. And I think, and this kind of ties into your book, which I want to talk about next, but this growing awareness I've had, both between learning about Robert Moses, but also really with the George Floyd protests and talking about, I think like one of the highways that they were protesting on in Minneapolis was one that was basically used to destroy like a Black community. And I think that's what a lot of us don't understand. We just look around and think, our communities just develop however they develop. Like there's not this intentional stuff. And quite frankly, a lot of times our cities, and Robert Moses is an example of this, were developed in ways that intentionally benefited some communities and some groups, and basically intentionally, or at least definitely did harm other groups. And a lot of times, unfortunately, that was along racial lines. I also just read a book about the levees being built along the Mississippi River. And again, the same thing there. The people who always benefited, that the government basically would give land to or make sure benefited, were the rich white people, right? And definitely never helped any Black individuals, but also did not help like poor white people. So I think urban planning and getting involved in our urban spaces is such a way to, it doesn't just address, oh, here's where a road is going to go. Like you said, it is a way to address the way we all live, the way we function, who gets to even thrive and succeed. So that is all a very long segue into your book, From the Ground Up, which I want you to talk about that and the kind of the inspiration for that. But I also have to tell readers just right now, in a world where so much can seem like very depressing and also seem so massive that we can't do anything, what I love about your book is this is a way that you can make changes that may not seem that big, but that can have a serious impact, and more importantly, can be replicated, right? So other people can take those ideas and do it somewhere else. So I'm obviously a big fan, but tell us first, like, what inspired your book?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that intro. I'd love to just touch for a minute on your point about systemic racism, because we're talking about it in regards to highways and roadways. But I have to say, in my research, I found it related to almost everything from researching tree canopy and green infrastructure to bike lanes and transit. Systemic racism has really shaped the landscape in this country, because we've had discriminatory policies like redlining and restrictive covenants that often correlate race with where people live in cities and how well resourced their neighborhoods are, how much they have access to good transit, and also how they're affected by climate change. Even in tree canopy alone, it can be 15 degrees hotter on one side of the city without trees than another that's more affluent. So this is very much on my mind as I researched and wrote From the Ground Up.
In there too, and make 1.2 that a lot of these decisions, like with the levees along the Mississippi or like with Robert Moses, they may have been made decades ago. But I think a lot of people now are like, that was all generations ago and now everything's fine. And I'm like, no, these decisions and actions that were made years and years ago are still impacting people and have consequences that, until we physically actually change things, are going to continue to have consequences, right?
Absolutely. And also are being renewed. When we have money come from the infrastructure bill, it can either reestablish the systems that we have today, or it can be a great boon for rethinking them. And so absolutely, this is not distant history. This has everything to do with the way in which we're living today in cities. And it's something that we have to consciously redress. I started from the ground up thinking about, well, I'm really concerned about the urgency of climate change and how I had confronted it in our own work in cities, but I also wanted to understand how other cities around the country were really thinking about meeting the challenges of climate change. And to get back to this point, what I found is that they were doing much more, that they weren't just looking at how to mitigate and adapt to climate change. They were looking at how to create more equitable and livable communities in the process. And that really came to supporting solutions that are led by locals. The book is structured in 4 parts, and all of them are a call to action. And it profiles case studies in each of those parts of cities where those things are happening and they're on the ground and they're unfolding now. So it starts with reclaim the streets. So when we can reclaim the streets from cars to create safe places to walk and bike and more efficient public transit for everyone, we can lower carbon emissions, but we also create greater equity as we afford people access to jobs and opportunities that they wouldn't have if they don't have good public transit, for example. We can tear up the concrete in cities so that we can create green streets and rain gardens and floodable parks that help us to slow stormwaters from present day and future flooding. And then we also make the places that we live more lush and alive, which helps our health, it has all kinds of other benefits to our lives. It helps biodiversity. And we can plant to build on that in the space made available from rethinking our streets, especially. We can plant cities with street trees and expand our urban tree canopy, which sequesters carbon and reduces air pollution and cools our streets. And then the book ends with looking at our shorelines. How do we adapt them with restoring wetlands and other nature-based solutions like oyster reefs so that we can buffer future storms and protect frontline communities? And one of the things over and over is that we can do all of this work, by providing jobs and really greater economic security to communities that have been historically under-resourced. So From the Ground Up describes 12 cities from Baltimore and New Orleans and New York to Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, Portland, and San Francisco, all these places where this work is underway today.
And we would love to hear specific examples about all these stories. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I met you last year in Philadelphia at a resilience event, Resilience Summit, and I was impressed about your book, which you were selling then, and I bought a couple. And these stories, just to reiterate what you just said, they're such great examples of things that can be done around the country and the world. And I think that there are the cities that you highlight on this book that are already doing it. So can we talk about specific examples, and let's start down south. You have a great story about New Orleans. Can you tell us a little bit more about that one?
They're confronting the realities of climate change earlier than a lot of other cities in the country. And I had the opportunity to meet a woman named Angela Chalk, who is the executive director of Healthy Community Services. And during Hurricane Katrina, she lives in the 7th Ward. It was one of the hardest hit neighborhoods in the city. But Angela was one of the first people to move back to her neighborhood. And she was interested in directing investments there that could support. It's very clear to people in New Orleans that it's not one storm, it's multiple storms. So she was interested in taking this massive storm as an opportunity to think about how she might think about investments in her neighborhood, especially with green infrastructure. And so she worked with a group called Waterwise Gulf South, which is a citywide nonprofit. And she used her own backyard and her house and her block eventually as a way of creating a demonstration project for what native plants and bioswales could do to mitigate flooding. And so she did it all around her own house. And then when the next storm hit, and she didn't flood, her neighbors were interested. What did you do? What were you doing? And so she ended up knowing them. She ended up bringing them together like in her house over home cooked meals and great gatherings to really talk about the power of green infrastructure and how it works, but also how it complements the really complex system of pumps and levees that manage water in New Orleans. And today, the Seventh Ward, entire blocks of demonstration projects are throughout her neighborhood. She's also helped to be part of and create a Waterwise champion group, which is like a network and a training program where it connects local knowledge and technical information about green infrastructure so that people are not only experts in their own neighborhoods, but they're also teaching other folks that have similar issues about how to solve them. And there was a great quote in the book. Angela said that people in her neighborhood can tell you about native plants. They can tell you about the capacity of a cypress tree to hold water or clean the air. Everybody's a green infrastructure specialist now. And today, these community-led approaches that happened in the Seventh Ward and beyond it, Angela wasn't the only one. There's a network of incredible community leaders. Their work has inspired the development of an entire resilience district in New Orleans. Often experiments start small, but then really their successes can be scaled up. And that applies to many of the examples of projects in the book.
Something I really like about your book is that there are successful stories. And one challenge I have noticed in my years of working in the climate resilience space is that sometimes those success stories don't make the paper, the media, the news outlets, because news of things that go wrong or break are just more attractive to the audience. I remember our very first guest, Shalini Vajala, talks about a success story in Hoboken and how thrilled she was that it made the New York Times when there was, I forget what hurricane or what storm, but the story was Hoboken didn't flood. But sometimes those stories just don't make it to the media. So
Yeah.
I think one of the things to admire about your book is that you brought a dozen stories out in the world of what success can look like in the resilience space.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think also I was stunned that these stories hadn't been told already. I find them so hopeful, and that people are working in communities doing all kinds of things that are of real consequence. So I think this book is an attempt to shine a light on stories that really do need to be told more broadly.
Well, and I will say we're going to put a link to your book and where people can buy it, because we definitely think everyone should read it, especially number one, again, there's just such great and innovative ideas, but it is also really hopeful. We won't ask you to tell all of the stories, but we do want to highlight just at a high level a few more. If you could tell us, New Orleans is obviously, I think, the city we all think of when we think of climate change. But then when we think about what is an urban city and what is it like to live in a cramped, crazy city, we think of New York. So can you tell us about the 34th Avenue in New York?
Yeah, absolutely. 34th Avenue is in Jackson Heights, Queens, in New York City. And for those in your audience that may not know it, it's people live in tight quarters there, and there's really not enough open space. And so people in Jackson Heights suffered some of the worst effects of the pandemic. It had one of the highest mortality rates in the borough. And it's a place where there are a lot of people that come from other countries, and 167 languages are spoken in Jackson Heights alone. I think it's probably the most diverse place on the planet. It's an extraordinary place. And given that there weren't enough like parks and open space and that people are living in tight quarters there, the city ended up creating an open street program. They closed the street to cars and they made it open to people as a public park. And this is under Mayor de Blasio. But the way in which they did it was they created barricades across the streets and they put police on the corners. It looked more like a checkpoint than an invitation to occupy the street. And so I think a lot of people just didn't feel like that street reflected what they wanted. And so they closed the open street and they called it a failure. But the locals, like the neighbors, just did not let the open street go. And so they brought people together. They closed one block with like homemade signs and they got everyone out and they called the media and they showed people what an open street can look like. And then as a result, started something called the 34th Avenue Open Streets Coalition. They turned that one block into the longest open street in New York City. It's now 26 blocks long. And there are community bike rides after school. There's hula hooping classes. There's games of Sapo. I tried to learn to dance the cumbia on 34th Avenue. There are exercise classes, there's performances, neighbors get together to celebrate holidays. And then there's a huge tradition and successful tradition of mutual aid there. So there's food and distribution, clothing distribution. And now Nuala O'Doherty, who is one of the co-founders of the Open Street, she's a lawyer. And she started something where legal advice would be freely given to people seeking asylum. There's ESL meetings on the corners. And I think what's incredible is that this shows that the most effective solutions are really the ones that are born out of the communities that they serve. Jim Burke, he's been a lovely host to me over many visits to 34th Avenue. He talked to me about how the street was providing this like essential social infrastructure. And he pointed out that before it was closed during the pandemic, or before the pandemic struck and it was created, he didn't actually know his neighbors. He went to work and came home, but he didn't really know the people on the street. And now he talks about we all know each other now. And it's incredible when you walk down the street with Jim Burke, he's the mayor, right? He literally knows everyone. You cannot walk for 5 minutes without him being stopped dozens of times. So it's really incredible to see a street like that functioning so well and continuing, started at a time of emergency, but now it's continuing to thrive. There's always something new coming up. And what's interesting too is that the city itself is learning from what's happening there. Now that more permanent infrastructure is being introduced to many of the open streets in New York City, they're actually learning from neighbors there about what works and what doesn't. How do you run a bike lane through that street? How do you put a barrier up? I mean, for example, the city put concrete barriers, and then then the people of Jackson Heights, they ended up doing this whole art project on them. There's this iterative design where, what's being learned there, and you can't cookie cutter things and assume that what works in Jackson Heights will work everywhere. But you can make communities the leaders of what happens on their street and have them innovate new directions. So it's a really exciting example, and I go there as often as I can.
I appreciate the reference to cumbia. Both my parents are Colombian, so I want to believe that cumbia rhythms run through my blood. I think this is really a story about empowered community members, which we all are. So even if you're running a portfolio of 100 buildings in your property development or management portfolio, you are still a community member wherever you live. So I think that we all have the ability to today take an action in our neighborhood, right? I think especially after COVID, it was really obvious how social interaction is necessary for our mental health. Lately, I've been reading a lot about disease prevention and how just having friends, right? Having close friends, having even just acquaintances, being able to interact with people prevents diseases. I don't take that lightly. I lead the block parties in my street. So every couple of months we have block parties, and we always get to meet a new neighbor that has been here for 8 years and we have never seen because maybe the times that we go outside never coincide. I think it has made our street better for it. Maybe it's just 1 block long. It's not 26 blocks, which is so impressive.
There's a man, a social scientist named Eric Kleinenberg, that's really talked about this idea of social infrastructure really beautifully over a set of books. And he actually wrote about 34th Avenue also in his book called 2020. But before that, he's written several books. I think it was his PhD thesis, he wrote about the Chicago heat wave in 1995. And he documented that the people who knew their neighbors actually survived the heat wave more. In neighborhoods where people knew each other, they could check on each other in times of emergency. And that was literally the difference between living and dying in extreme weather. It is absolutely about knowing our neighbors because of the joy and the everyday experience of knowing the people around you, and also just facing each other's realities, and building trust and common care for one another that is so important. But you can really see how even in times of emergency, it's essential.
I also have heard that one heat mitigation strategy is know the people that live around you. There are, especially the elderly who live alone, just having somebody to check on them. Are you okay? Do you have AC? If you don't have AC, here's a community center, or you can stay in my living room for a couple hours. It is so important. It's simple and so important.
Absolutely. And I think reuses of the street, like parklets, and Parking Day, and which I can talk a little bit about. These are all attempts to use the space of the street for more than parking and moving cars. And streets are places that when we can enliven them and use them for other purposes, we're building social infrastructure because there are places to sit. There are places to come in contact with one another. There is an opportunity to have a street tree on your block, which will mitigate heat down the line. There's all of those things. So even these little tiny projects that take a parking spot at a time, they're significant because they do explode, and it's been amazing. So just to back up a touch, Parking Day is a project that people may or may not be familiar with. It was actually just celebrated at the end of September, and it was started in 2005. So it's had a long run now, and it was started by, I was describing how when we founded the Studio for Urban Projects, we were in an ecology of people that were looking at tactical experiments, and our colleagues and friends at Rebar, who are all another collective of designers and artists, ended up creating a project where they fed a downtown parking meter. They were looking at real estate, and they were like, the cheapest real estate in any city is parking spot. And if we fill the meter and rent it for an hour, we don't need to park a car there. We could put anything there. And so they decided to put a park there, and they rolled out some sod, and they put a bench up, and they put a tree up. And the first person that came along and sat on the bench and ate their sandwich, they were like, we've had success. And what was amazing is this is also a little bit of the early days of social media. And that picture just took off. People got so excited about it that Rebar's phone was, maybe not their phone, their email was filling. And people were asking them, can you come do it in our city? And they couldn't do it everywhere that there was interest. And they were like, if there is this much interest, we should make it open source. And so they created, so the first installation was called Parking. And then the next day they celebrated Parking Day. And they made it open source manual. So anyone, anywhere, all over the world could make what they wanted. And there were some great projects. I think there was like croquet courses. And I took my kids to a demonstration garden where they learned to compost. And there was libraries and urban beaches and all kinds of yoga classes, like all kinds of amazing things that you could do in just 140 square feet of a parking spot. And today it's celebrated all over the world. It's become a real infectious idea. But it not only is a holiday in September, it's also engendered all of these official parklet programs. So the city was, we had some really great folks working in city government, Andreas Power in particular, who said, why can't we just make this an official program? Businesses, cultural organizations can actually steward the parking spot right outside their place. And so they started an official permit, people could apply. And by 2019, there were 80 parklets across San Francisco. And it's crazy because at the time I thought that was a lot. But during the pandemic, the idea exploded. There was outdoor dining. There were all kinds of, we needed to use the street for all kinds of things. And parklets became one of the ways in which we could do that. I just looked at the numbers, and in San Francisco today, there's 1,400 shared space permits that have been given, and many more have been applied for. So it is much more common now. And it's not just in San Francisco, but in many cities across the world. You've seen this. In New York, we have it. They're everywhere. There are many of the European cities I've traveled to, they exist there. And with one parking spot, we've developed a set of tools for how we use the public right-of-way more broadly. This just comes back to another example of how kind of small experiments can ultimately lead to large-scale changes.
And especially, I love what you were talking about with social infrastructure. And you also mentioned green infrastructure. Mónika and I focus, because of our experience, our jobs, on obviously more the built, the hard infrastructure, right? But we also talk all the time about you can have the most resilient, sustainable building in the world, but if the community around it isn't functioning, that really doesn't matter. And so we're also looking at some of these bigger issues and how they all relate. Transportation, obviously, I know even with dealing with clients, transportation is an issue because yes, you're often even limited in who you can hire or who's available for your workforce if people have to rely on cars to get to the job, right? And America tends to be very car focused in all of our transportation. And so I love some of the ideas that have been being worked on here in Madison. They're really trying to, we don't have I do miss the DC Metro. We don't have a subway system, but we're really trying to up our busing game, for example. And of course, biking is something that's popular here in Madison and also in my home state of Minnesota. I was very excited to read the piece on the Minneapolis biking because, and I'll let you talk about it, but yeah, I've got family who live in Minneapolis. They love to bike. They bike all the time, but they do live in a more privileged neighborhood. And so if you could talk a little bit about the Minneapolis biking experiment and kind of some of the lessons that were learned there.
Yeah, biking in Minneapolis is no joke either. People bike there year round, and it's one of the coldest climates for it. So I'm always amazed that it's one of the best cycling cities in the country. And you can bike in Minneapolis in places like the Midtown Greenway, where you're crossing the entire city on a completely separated bike trail for miles and miles. It's extraordinary, but it's not everywhere. And it's especially not in communities of color. Getting back to the impact of redlining and systemic racism more broadly. It's a real problem in so many cities, and it is a huge problem in Minneapolis. So I ended up covering the project called the North Minneapolis Greenway, and it in the northern part of the city. And I think the city has tried to acknowledge the racism that has gone into its public infrastructure, which is not only bike lanes, but also transit. And they launched a 3-mile pilot, like a temporary project for the north side, where it was a greenway. They painted bike lanes and they put picnic tables out, and they created a temporary version of what this could be. But the community really wasn't involved, or didn't feel involved enough in that process. And worse, many people imagined that, or not imagined, and many people reflected that it could have been driving gentrification and ultimately displacement from their neighborhood. And often this happens with biking infrastructure. If the community isn't involved in creating what the infrastructure is, it looks like the leading edge of development, and development that is not inclusive and is not wanting long-term residents to stay where they are. So unfortunately, there was a group that came out called Stop the North Minneapolis Greenway, and they removed a section of the pilot. And it really wasn't until Will Lumpkins and Alexis Penny, who were two local people that had grown up in the neighborhood and really wanted to bring investments to it, they started something called the Northside Greenway Now. And they were able to bring their neighborhood together. They knocked on doors and they talked with their neighbors, and they met at block parties, and they met at open streets events, and they took people on community rides. And through all of their efforts, they created a common vision for what a greenway was, which was even questioning, what should it be for local businesses? Should it just be for biking? Is it a pedestrian? All of these questions. Should kids feel safe biking to school there? All of those really important questions to a community that this was going to be a centerpiece of. And so that common vision, they've been extraordinary at getting it successfully put into the city's budget, and is now identified as a priority project, as the city is underway in making something like 50 plus miles of neighborhood greenways across the city. But even today, I actually just checked the numbers in the lead up to this call, because I hadn't checked them in a little while. And in the book, I think I report that the construction wasn't going to be completed until 2026. Now it's 2028. And communities like North Minneapolis deserve those investments today. This is not only an example of how community leadership is really key to creating effective solutions, but also that we really need to make sure that we're investing in communities that have been under-resourced in the past. It's very hard for people in North Minneapolis to give up cars when they don't have transit as a viable option. It's really important that communities can address and be clear about what they need as part of the solutions of creating bike infrastructure, transit infrastructure, all sorts of things. And as we've seen with 34th Avenue, when you create something, there's all these surprises because the community is involved and they make it into what it needs to be for them.
Let's stay on the topic of biking. I love bike infrastructure, and every time I go to a new city, I try to bike. Let's go back to New York City.
Okay.
There was a story on your book about a bike share program that was successful. And there are many things that we wouldn't have thought of to make it successful, like being able to rent a bike without a credit card. Can you tell us more about that case?
Yeah, absolutely. So you may be familiar that New York City has the largest bike share system in the country. City Bike installed bike share stations in Bed-Stuy, which is in Brooklyn, a neighborhood in Brooklyn, but many of the residents there didn't ride them. Bed-Stuy is a low-income neighborhood in Brooklyn where the majority of residents are Black people. Due to cost, it was more expensive to use a bike share than it was to ride the subway. And the perception that City Bike wasn't necessarily intended for them, but maybe other people, made the program, it wasn't a successful program. And that is until Tracy Capers, who was from Bed-Stuy Restoration, which is a community development corporation. She helped lead a group called the New York City Better Bike Share Partnership. They really wanted to improve bike share, but also make it reflect the community that it was in and its needs. So they organized a series of community events, and they featured helmet giveaways and bike safety lessons and neighborhood rides. Youth from the neighborhood were hired as ambassadors to survey residents and understand what they needed. Why weren't they using bike share, and what would it help? And some of those ambassadors went on to join the New York DOT afterwards. And doctors and local hospitals prescribed free bike share memberships to encourage active transportation and to help residents of the community be healthier. Local employers subsidized memberships, and people that are part of the SNAP program, SNAP recipients were also given discounts. And then Restoration had a really interesting role in this too, when they met with local precincts to address racial profiling so that they could make it safer for people of color to actually ride bikes. And just in a year, membership increased 56%, which is more than it did citywide. So it's like many cases in the book, it's just one more of the system wasn't effective until it was really led by the community.
I love every single one of these stories, and we could talk about all of them, but we'll ask people instead to go read your book. But going back to this idea of this, first of all, community-driven change, right? Which I think is just such a recurring message of your book. And I see it here in Madison as well. You can have all sorts of well-intentioned people trying to do things, but if they're not actually things that the community wants or that the community is driving, they're not going to succeed. So I think that's obviously a huge message of your book. Another thing that we talked about before was social infrastructure and the benefits literally to people's physical health of having that social infrastructure. But what else? We're obviously in a really tumultuous time with lots of tough things going on at the local and the international level. What are the other benefits that you've seen of having that sort of social infrastructure and those tighter community connections?
We've talked a little bit about the climate impacts. We've talked a little bit about just the kind of joy of knowing each other. I think it's also a really crucial piece of democracy. I think streets are a place where we have the capacity to come to know one another. And social infrastructure is a huge part of that. But being able to face one another and to understand each other's realities and build trust and to care for one another, those are all things that we need to do together to manage what's ahead. And I think in a time, as you're pointing out, Jessica, that politics is polarizing and social media has us stuck in our silos, I've come to think of streets as being this incredibly potent venue for coming together and to really air the diversity of our own experiences and to see our common plight. I feel like democracy thrives when it's in a forum. It has a forum instead of a soundbite. So in researching from the ground up, I came to see kind of social infrastructure as one of the most important and critical pieces of future resiliency and the state of our democracy. I don't know, if we have time, I would love to just read a little tiny section from the conclusion, because being a writer, you work on the language and try and get it tight. So I'll read this to you and you can tell me, but I think it speaks to this idea. So this is in the conclusion of the book, and this is written right after January 6th and the attack on the Capitol. So this was very much on my mind when I was writing this. This book is a call to action. When we make the places we live more porous, lush, and alive, we need to make them socially just, resilient, and self-directed, and in so doing, address the history of injustice. We must invest in under-resourced communities first, providing not only transit routes, bike lanes, green spaces, and parks, but also affordable housing, jobs, and public education. Together, these actions represent investment in the capacity of people, Informed by a shared base of knowledge about the environmental reality ahead, they may envision and direct the plans that are acted upon by policymakers, urban planners, and practitioners. Government officials, nonprofit organizations, community-based groups, and individual advocates may build alliances to support and embolden this vision together. It's a recipe for how we restore and reinvigorate the democratic process and move forward to creating the resilient cities that will be essential to managing the storms ahead.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you for doing that. We got lucky. We didn't know that we were going to do a book reading during the podcast. So thank you. Thank you for that. It's such a good summary of call for action. And that was going to be our next question. We're all community members. We're all a player in the real estate community. Our listeners are designers, they're architects, they're engineers, they're building managers and owners and investors and construction folks and lawyers. If there are any other calls for action for all of these players in the real estate world?
So this is a great question because I think many of us are looking for ways that we can make a difference. And what I've come to is that in the United States, transportation accounts for the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions. It's more than electricity or industry or agriculture. And among those emissions, the largest share of that comes from the vehicles that we see on our roads every day. Cars, SUVs, minivans, and trucks. So we need to find other ways to move people and goods. So what can one person do in that? I think the most practical, you can get out of your car. You can ride or walk or take transit to work or school, even just a few times a week makes a big difference. And when you need to drive, using a shared electric car instead of owning one reduces the spaces that cars take up, both being parked or driven on the roads. It also cuts emissions and makes room for all these other things like bike lanes and safer streets and more efficient public transit. I think we can also all get involved. We need to go to public meetings and demand better transit. We have a long history of the 80-20 split, which is 80% of our public funding goes into highways and 20 goes into public transit. We're never going to build a robust public transit network and make transit a viable option for anyone, rural, urban, anyone, until we invest in public transit. So we need to show up and we need to make sure that our elected leaders know that. We can advocate for parking removal. We can advocate for using streets for people. We can find people and organizations in our communities that are making a difference and help them. And Mónika, you're talking about working with your neighborhoods, one block at a time, a block party, host a block party, host an open street, or create a parklet in your neighborhood and support local businesses instead of ordering online and having delivery trucks driving all over the place, jamming our streets, which has been a huge problem in New York City. And then for businesses and organizations, larger groups, it's creating incentives for people to bike or walk or take transit to work is great. Subsidizing bike share membership and offering transit passes are some ways, and also disincentivizing driving. Don't provide free parking, all those kinds of things. And then we're coming up on a huge and important election. So I think all of us are feeling like voters right now. We need to elect leaders that are addressing climate change, that want to increase investments in public transit, that want to create transit-oriented development instead of widening highways, which we talked a little bit and touched on the IIJA, the infrastructure bill. Right now, 25% of the IIJA funding is spent, and some of the earliest research points to that it actually may increase carbon emissions because in the hands of state DOTs, highways are being widened, not torn down, not restructured, but actually widened. So what has been hailed as a bill that could really aid climate change may actually not, unless we demand that it doesn't. We need to pass things like congestion pricing in this country. New York City is teetering on the edge of it. It has to go through. We've not paid for driving, and we pay for public transit every day, right? We need to pay to drive, and we need to make roads safe. Because without safety on roads, people can't bike and walk, and traffic fatalities are a huge problem in this country. To end that, we need to invest when we're thinking about investing in transportation infrastructure, that funding really needs to go to communities that have been historically under-resourced and that have over and over borne the cost of pollution and traffic violence.
I love all of that. I feel like this is becoming a little bit of a book club. I have to reference one other book that I've also started talking about cars and safety, which is called There Are No Accidents, and basically how when cars first became a thing and there were accidents that were caused by cars, we were blaming the cars, not the pedestrians who were used to having the streets, like that they had equal right to the streets. And basically through like the car lobby and everything, it actually switched, right? So that cars basically became the owners of the streets and everybody else had to make way. And if there were accidents, it was everybody else's fault. That's another book to read that I think is really interesting, that shows, yes, how none of these things are like inalienable truths, right? That we must have cars, or that cars must be the primary use of streets or something like that. This is all just the cultural decisions that we make. Just another segue there. We have so enjoyed talking to you. We could talk for hours, but instead, before we do wrap up here, I know you're working on a new book. Could you just tell us briefly about that?
Yes, the next book is called Street Life. It's really looking, you can tell how interested I'm becoming in all of this, and have been. Obviously, the first part of the book was dedicated to streets and reclaiming the streets from the ground up. But right now, I'm focusing exclusively on streets and really writing a global book addressing it. The streets are some of our largest public spaces in any city. It's like 25 to 35% at least of the land in the cities we live in. We all have some relationship to them. They're the first things that we encounter in the morning and the last thing that we see before we return to our homes at night. As you point out, Jessica, more than 100 years ago, US streets were shared spaces. They were used mainly by people walking and biking and riding transit or horse-drawn carriage, and occasionally by people driving cars. But today they've become dominated by automobiles. This version of mobility has come at a huge cost. We've talked about the climate costs of transportation emissions, but cars have also eroded our common, and they cost us our lives every day. It's not an accident. This is traffic violence. 46,000 people died on US roads in 2021. From the time a child is born to the time they're 18, it's the #1 way in which they are killed. Only recently has gun violence even come close to traffic violence in killing us. During the pandemic, other countries saw traffic fatalities decline, but in the US, they went up. Street Life looks at the opportunity to reimagine our roadways, especially after the pandemic, when we've had the experience of using hundreds of miles of streets for people. They were closed to cars and open to people, and we've seen the great variety of what we can do with them in this time of emergency, when they were used as venues for exercising and gathering and going to school or shopping or eating out, or just simply taking a walk without being worried about being run over. There's a lot more we can do too. When there's less cars, we can mitigate flooding, we can create urban forests. I've been looking at global cities and exploring the variety of ways in which we can use our streets, and I'm so inspired by what I'm seeing. So just by taking on the idea of lowering transportation emissions, which sounds wonky, it creates all of these other benefits that are so important to the quality of life that we have. So we can do it all. And I think it's really important right now to remember that cities and our streets are the product choices that we make about how we want to live, so we can shape them into the places that we want in our lives.
You have given us so many action items for all of our listeners to walk away with. I have to highlight the fact that your book, From the Ground Up, has amazing graphics. That's one of the things that really caught my attention. It's a beautiful book. And I have no doubt that your upcoming book will be the same. We'll put all the links of all these books that we have talked about, but you are strongly encouraged to read From the Ground Up first. Thank you, Alison, for being on our podcast. This has been a treat.
It's been so much fun to talk to both of you. And also, just because you mentioned it, I want to give credit to Packard Jennings for the illustrations From the Ground Up, and to Rob Ungar for all of his research work, and to Island Press, who's published both of my books. Thank you, both of you, for inviting me on, and for your wonderful work in this field.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Adapt: Climate Change and the Built Environment. We hope you enjoyed this episode and come back to hear more of our conversations with people leading the way and addressing the issues facing the built environment as our climate changes. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and share our podcast with others who may be interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests for future seasons, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at adaptthebuiltenvironment@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.